So I now have the pleasure of introducing Mariah Levison, Convergence's new Chief Program Officer, who's going to be leading the next session focused on Convergence's economic opportunity impact area. We're really very lucky to have Mariah on the Convergence team as she brings a deep bench in collaborative problem solving. She comes from the Minnesota State Office of Collaboration and Dispute Resolution, which she helped to create and she directed. And while she was there, she designed and managed processes for public policy consensus building and dispute resolution among and within governmental agencies at all levels and with outside stakeholders. So Mariah, over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. So excited to be here today, and I'm thrilled to have joined Convergence this month. And the reason is that I get to work with John Powell. Those were incredibly powerful words, John. Thank you so much. My own work leading Convergence style dialogues on really divisive issues, including things like police community relations and work about monuments and representation, is that it all really boils down to what John has shared. In my own experience, all of these disagreements are really about the fear that we can't all belong, that we can't all get our needs met, really that we can't all be loved. So again, thank you, John, for your words today and for your really powerful work. As many of you have experienced firsthand and all of you have heard, Convergence creates moments and dialogues when former opponents come to care about each other's concerns and care about each other's people in the ways that John spoke about. And these moments are incredibly powerful. And what excites me so much and what led me to join Convergence is that Convergence not only creates these kind of interactions among people who are well positioned to address significant matters of public interest, but the new 5-year strategy focuses on leveraging the trust and problem solving that occurs in dialogues to strengthen our democracy and society at a time when it is so needed. One of the key aspects of my position is to increase the already substantial and important impact of Convergence dialogues. As you all know, one of the many ways in which we are working to maximize the impact of the dialogues is by creating impact focus areas. Impact focus areas will enable Convergence to increase impact by, among other things, building upon the outcomes and impacts of past dialogues within each impact area. So today, you'll have the chance to hear more about one of those focus areas, the economic opportunity area. First, we're going to have Vice President for Programs, Russell Krumnow. He'll give an overview of this impact area, which he leads. And then we'll hear a few minutes from Anita Chandramohan, who is the director of the new Convergence Dialogue on Pathways to Better Jobs, and from Abby McCloskey, who just concluded the assessment for the new Convergence Dialogue on Supports for Working Families. After that, I'll moderate a discussion amongst our panelists. I have a list of questions for them, but I would much prefer to discuss what's most interesting to all of you. As a former Leadership Council member myself, I really appreciate the value of getting to what's really interesting to all of you who are on the call with us today. So please start chatting your questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Russell?
Thanks a lot, Mariah. Good to be with the family here with the Leadership Council. I'm going to give a little bit of high-level context, and I'm really excited to be in discussion in just a minute with Anita and Abby, who I am honored to partner with and work with closely all the time on this really great, complicated, and fun programmatic work. And they're both doing a fantastic job leading their projects. So the idea here, as Mariah said, and this links up with the 5-year strategy, is that many of our larger organizational goals can be achieved and that we can accelerate impact if we actually put some markers down and stay in an issue space beyond just one individual project. This is our considered opinion and our view, having been at this for a while, but we're going to learn as we go. David is challenging us to be a learning organization, and so we're going to course correct and we're going to take in new information. But the idea here is that we gain credibility in the space. We build relationships with key funders and other key strategic partners if we're actually in an issue space for longer than one project. We also learn a whole lot during these dialogues. And while we do critical and important work, we also identify gaps that our dialogues don't tackle, right? And so by having a vertical or an issue area that we stay in, that gives us space to then go after the pieces of the issue that we did not tackle for whatever reason in the prior conversation. It also holds space for perhaps some of the dialogue stakeholders to carry through and keep participating with us, even as we'll keep bringing sort of fresh voices and perspectives in. So we have a lot of excitement about this way of framing our work. I want to reassure folks, this does not mean Convergence won't tackle issues that are sort of outside of the issue buckets we're beginning to shape up. There's going to be lots of space for that. We're always going to hold the possibility to be opportunistic, to be responsive to events, to tackle both sort of longer flagship dialogues and very short, innovative, creative, short form efforts in issue spaces that sort of don't neatly fit into these buckets. So there's absolutely room for that. But we think there's a lot to be gained from staying in these spaces. So economic opportunity, I don't think needs a lot of selling for why it would be a space that we would work in. We obviously have a very strong foundation of past work here, which I'll very quickly touch on to summarize for people. But we can also clearly see this is a signal challenge for the country. I think this would be in anyone's sort of top three issue buckets, right, left, and center on what's sort of most important. And critically, I'll say that we also believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, that access to economic opportunity for everyone and a multiple pathways approach to opportunity where there's lots of ways to get on track that really fit with your own life and lived experience and how life really plays out for people. We believe that's actually connected to our health as a society and our democracy overall, right? If people have a connection to community, to work and to opportunity, and they can see a pathway to building a better life, we actually believe that that also can build agency in other spaces, whether that's feeling connection to your institutions, feeling greater trust in them, feeling a little bit stronger of a sense that what you do sort of matters and connects up to positive changes for your own family, for the street that you live on, for the community that you live in, and out from there. So we do think there's a link here also critically to, I know, some of the larger concerns folks have around the health of our democracy. So these issues are not disconnected. As folks know, several years ago, I led a project called Working Up, which was a first really a foray into this issue space. Was really premised on how could work be an engine of greater upward economic mobility, especially for folks in sort of low and moderate wage work in particular. We built a really dynamic table, and as folks have heard us report out on that project many times, we were able to have some really important real-time impacts on major employers who sat at that table, especially Walmart, which is the largest private employer in the country. They were sitting at a table with advocacy groups and folks from different perspectives with whom they sort of shared uncomfortable or even hostile relationships in the past, and also with a number of folks that they simply did not know. And we were able in real time during that dialogue, and folks have heard us say, craft a framework that Walmart essentially put into their own internal documents and used back at HQ at Bentonville, Arkansas, to frame up an internal opportunity agenda, which we've now seen over the years since shape things like career pathways in their stores, allowing workers to have a little bit more input on predictable scheduling while maintaining flexibility, again, which goes to the heart of if you can manage your childcare with your schedule, with your community college class, et cetera. And they made big investments in tuition assistance efforts that have allowed many of their associates to now go on and get associate's degrees, credentials, and even four-year degrees at a very low cost. And they've made some expansions in some of those efforts even since the initial rollout. So we were able to see some really powerful short-term impacts out of that dialogue. Folks also know we brought back together some of the people from that project during the very acute phase of the pandemic in 2020, along with some additional voices, and had a series of really intense and helpful conversations about what would an equitable economic recovery look like as that acute phase of the pandemic began to sort of recede, but we still had this huge upheaval and disruption, lots of folks thrown out of work, some folks being more empowered to sort of choose new jobs, a lot of interesting and complicated things going on. And that group helped us tee up where Convergence could then take on in our next kind of short to medium term phase of work, which teed up two projects, which we are now so thrilled are moving forward. One is Pathways to Better Jobs. You're going to hear more about that from Anita in just a moment. And the other is Supports for Working Families, which you're going to hear more about from Abby. Anita's project has now launched this dialogue, and we're hoping to pull in the funding and finalize the frame and get the families focused dialogue launched in the fall. And so we'll have really two efforts running in parallel in a really interesting way for Convergence to have a lot of learning going on, some cross-pollination and sharing. And then in the long term beyond those, we imagine staying in this economic opportunity space for the long haul. We could probably all think of other dimensions in this issue space that are going to be so important as we think about the workforce of the future, as we think about how climate change is impacting communities, as we think about the ways that higher education is changing and evolving and frankly needs to change and evolve faster to actually link up with what people need to succeed in the 21st century economy. So there's a lot of space for us to keep tilling new ground. We're really thrilled with that relationship with Walmart that I mentioned. And I think this goes as a sort of a proof point to this idea that we'd have a long-term stay in an issue space. They've continued to stay close with us and participate and are now funding the Pathways to Better Jobs work along with other funders, not the only one that Anita is leading. They've also opened up doors of opportunity for us to have individual interviews with Walmart associates, which are going to be this really powerful grassroots input into that dialogue. As folks know, in addition to the tables that we convene with folks with a national perspective, we look for lots of creative ways to do listening on the ground really close to the lived experience. And so that relationship, I think, is a proof point of how staying in these spaces can really pay off over the long term, hopefully in concrete impact and also in financial support for the projects and for the organization. We also, through people like Abby, who we brought on as a consultant to lead the assessment on supports for working families, recognize there's also new networks to build. And so we pulled some relationships forward from that original project that I described, but we've also dug into new places and new networks, and Abby has brought aboard a range of interesting folks we've spoken to with significant ideological diversity, given her own background and expertise. The last thing I'll say is that we hope that this solves some at least partially solves some challenges Convergence has, which can involve how do we staff projects, right? Where people don't know if they're coming on board for a sort of a short-term effort, or are they here as a sort of a long-term staffer that's really digging in around our mission. Staying in these issue spaces for a longer time can give us just more creative ways to bring on and engage and cultivate great staff, which we know is really the lifeblood of making the work go. So that's a little bit about the thinking behind our focus areas, Mariah, and I'm thrilled that this economic opportunity portfolio is really being brought to life by two great leaders like Anita and Abby.
Thank you, Russell. And I'll pass it right over to you, Anita, for you to tell us a little bit about the Pathways Dialogue.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariah. And thanks, Russell, for a wonderful introduction. So as Russell mentioned, we are currently in the dialogue phase of the Pathways to Better Jobs project and are very excited. We actually have our second meeting tomorrow. We started in mid-May and have such a dynamic and powerful set of participants who are joining us from different stakeholder groups. This includes things like medium and large employers, public sector officials, higher education institutions, groups representing labor and worker voice, as well as research and data focused individuals. And all of the participants are spanning different states, sectors, and specializations within the workforce system. And as Russell also highlighted, in addition, we have grassroots components and data that we're really excited to lift up and feed into the dialogue group. We are going to be conducting 150 interviews with Walmart associates across the Chicagoland area, and then also work with another group called Civic Genius, where they're going to be conducting town halls and collecting the most up-to-date needs, concerns, and opportunity areas from workers on the ground. So we can funnel that input into the dialogue conversation as well, so we can really have a more richer and deliberate impact-driven conversations around recommendations and solutions. So just to kind of go back a little bit, during the assessment phase, which we held from January to May of this year, there were over 130 interviews conducted with stakeholders from a lot of those different sectors that I mentioned, coming from different ideologies across the country. And it was really apparent that there is still significant strife and disconnect when it comes to job seekers seeking flexible, supportive employment opportunities, employers who are still seeing huge hiring gaps, particularly in sectors like hospitality, food service, retail, et cetera, and how different individuals and groups are able to take advantage of some skilling opportunities that are going to lead to higher wage and advancement in different career areas. And so we're still seeing significant strife, particularly in entry-level moderate wage work. And for folks who have traditionally been disenfranchised or marginalized in a lot of ways, and really saw those disparities increased by the pandemic and certainly did not disappear, even though things have kind of slowed down and unemployment levels have gone down a little bit. We still see huge amounts of women who have completely left the workforce, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And there are a lot of disconnects that still exist in our current workforce system. And that's a lot of the things that we're looking to address in this dialogue. And so after our first meeting, we see 3 focus areas that have emerged, and we're hoping to kind of dive into those through working groups, specific recommendations, et cetera. And those are 1, digital literacy and skilling, earn and learn models, and employer supports. And so we're going to be talking more about that in our second meeting tomorrow and throughout the summer to really understand where impact areas are, how we can leverage the participants' expertise, and understand current innovations and opportunity gaps where the dialogue can have that impact piece, thinking about strengthening access and advocating for more resources, which are bringing economic opportunity to a lot of the populations that we still see struggling.
Thank you, Anita. Abby, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Supports for Working Families dialogue?
I'd love to. Thanks, Mariah, and nice to be with you all. I, too, am still in the glow of John Powell. So if my mind trails off, that's what I'm thinking of. But his point on targeted universalism, I think, is apt for many things, but also on how we support working families. And how can we ensure that all families have the choices for work and care that work best for them and for the well-being of their kids. And that's been the nature of the project we've been working on for the last 4 months. And so just a bit about the moment and then the assessment. You know, I think we've all seen the news reports and polling that parents with young kids aren't doing well, that they're financially fragile, that they're stressed and anxious, that they feel isolated. And this was broken open in a large way during the COVID pandemic, but it's been something that's been going on for a long time. And, you know, challenges that continue now in an inflationary environment where costs are going up of childcare and just basic necessities, and that work alone doesn't feel like enough to give families the financial margin that they need to support themselves and their loved ones. So it's a right moment for this politically, and we saw Build Back Better, of course, in the last year be debated, which was the Democrat proposal for providing relief to working families with childcare and paid leave and universal pre-K, among other things. We're seeing Senator Romney put forward a proposal about a child allowance and paying families cash monthly to help with their expenses. There's a lot of movement on this issue in particular, which is why I was so overjoyed to get the call from Russell and David about addressing this project as part of Convergence. And this spring, we spoke to over 60 people who are stakeholders in these issues, everyone from child care providers to parent advocates, to child development psychologists, to labor market economists, to folks on the Senate in the Republican offices and Democrat offices, employers, to try to get a feel for where everyone's at, kind of off the record. You can say what you want, where do you stand on this issue, and where do you see potential progress or ability to move the ball going forward, both from a policy perspective, but also from employer practices and state government and civil society, like faith groups. How can we make it a better place to raise kids? So we have wrapped up those interviews, and this summer we'll be releasing the framing paper in true Convergence style that highlights some of the top line findings that we had from the assessment, and then hopefully kicking off a dialogue in the fall where we'll explore these issues deeper with a subset of the folks we talked to.
Thank you, Abby.
Yeah.
So our first question is about, we've talked a little bit about this idea of the impact areas. And so how do you see the complementarity between your 2 dialogues? Now, how are they related? Where are they different? How might having the 2 dialogues going on in this impact area support each other and lead to increased impacts? So maybe Anita and then Abby and then Russell, if you have anything to share.
Sure, thank you. You know, I think Abby touched on this, and I can certainly kind of speak deeper to the question, Mariah. The ecosystem that makes up our workforce is incredibly complex. And so the dialogues complement each other in that each is a very critical piece of the complex puzzle. For example, if someone has access to certain opportunities but can't take advantage of them because of moving schedules, childcare options, affordability, et cetera, then there really are very few limited options for success, and those are not accessible really to so many people. And I really feel like the dialogues are tackling two pieces which are very critical for working families to thrive, not only economically, but as mentioned, kind of socio-emotionally and mentally from a well-being perspective, because without any type of strong support for caregivers, progress towards better jobs is much less meaningful. There might be opportunities out there, but if you can't take advantage of them, it's almost like they don't exist, right? And so I think you can't have one conversation without having the other, and I'll just mention one statistic that really struck me as we were doing some of this research. So we obviously knew that tons of people, and women in particular, had left the workforce in the last few years due to the pandemic because of some childcare related needs. And actually in January of this year, there were an additional 275,000 women who left the workforce, which now places the women's workforce participation at 57%. That's a record low since 1988. And I feel like when we talk about unemployment numbers that are reported in the media talk about folks who have looked for a job in the last 4 months. It doesn't talk about people who have completely left the job and the workforce because opportunities don't exist that are flexible and respond to their needs. And that's so much of our women and caregiving population that I feel like it's not getting highlighted in the way that it really needs to be. And so I feel like the conversations that Abby and I are both having and these dialogues really work in very critical tandem with each other.
That's awesome, Anita. And just building on that, parenthood is an inflection point for a lot of people on their work, on their participation, on the types of jobs they want, on the flexibility they need, on requiring childcare outside the home, that it's a very kind of fragile time in the work relationship, especially for women and mothers. When you have a new child, you become a full-time caregiver on top of your full-time job and other things that you're juggling. So there's very much a connection there. And I think the lack of kind of both family-friendly supports on the employer side, but also on the government side, has created a lot of friction, I think, around families being able to have a wide range of flexible kind of work and care arrangements that let them put food on the table, but also let them care for their kids and have them in the types of early childhood environments they want.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as far as like some possible ways that the projects might be in further conversation, the Families Project Abby's leading, we're hoping to get it funded and moving and launched this fall. So it's not quite going, but if it gets up and running as we hope, the idea would be that we could brief the sets of stakeholders on what the others are discussing, because they're obviously going to be naming some of the challenges the other group is chewing on. And so we want to kind of keep at a very basic level, keep them informed of each other. We might invite folks to listen into conversations back and forth to sort of cross-pollinate ideas. We have all these really rich and interesting grassroots inputs that Anita is going to be gathering. Abby's project will have its own parallel, probably like parent conversations happening. And so whatever the write-ups and takeaways are from those, we also plan to kind of share across groups, because that's a really rich set of data that people would want to have to kind of broaden out their own perspective. Even in Anita's very first dialogue meeting, her stakeholders said like they're not there to solve childcare in her project, right? But many of them, Anita named that as a key barrier, as you were saying in your comments. And so we know right off the bat, they're telling us like these are interlocking challenges. And so instead of having to say, maybe we'll get to that later, this time we get to say we're working on both, which is really, really exciting. And so I think there's a lot of ways to share ideas back and forth. It also kind of doubles the network for impact, right? Who can open doors to gatekeepers? Who can get the deliverables that these two tables create in front of the right people, whether that's a set of principles, whether that's the sort of final consensus report they create, whether that's getting us meetings with sort of 5 key people that can be decision makers. We have an opportunity with some sort of interesting, related, overlapping, but distinct networks here to get in front of a lot more folks, which is another really exciting way I think the projects can sort of build a bit of a flywheel and help have even greater impact. So really excited about that as another possibility as we get a little bit farther down the track.
Great. So I know that it seems like the dialogue phase is, by far the most exciting phase of the process. But as someone who has done the work, in my experience, the assessment phase is also really rich. And as you're gathering all this information, you learn really new and surprising things, and also start to see, wow, there's some potential here. Here are these areas of overlap and places where some of these things fit together, and start to really sense the potential of the dialogue. So for each of you, Anita and Abby, what was something that you learned in the assessment that was surprising or really interesting?
Well, I do think that behind closed doors, there's so much more agreement than meets the eye publicly. But what was interesting, and again, gets back to John Powell's point, is when we'd start off with the challenges kind of facing families, people might have emphasized different things that you might expect, kind of depending on their organization or their point of view, where they're coming from politically. When we asked questions about kind of the end in mind of what would you want the country to look like if we were a better place for working parents raising kids, and we talked about parent mental health and maternal health and child well-being and people having choices to send their child to child care center or stay home or send them to the church mom's day out down the road. When we started digging deeper into those types of things and outcomes, there was a tremendous amount of agreement. And yeah, that was really exciting and something I wasn't necessarily expecting.
I think on our end, it actually was quite surprising, I think, to myself and my team around how many of the interviewees that we talked about biggest hurdles to upward job mobility and career pathways being chiefly logistical, right? So we hear a lot about kind of skilling and having the right degree and the right qualifications, but a lot of it came down to transportation barriers, housing, language, digital barriers. And so thinking about ways that we could have the dialogue really address some of those things, which were more around investments, particularly in adult worker and incumbent worker populations. We invest so heavily in K through 12, understandably, but then, once someone kind of turns 18, they're completely left to the wind. And if they want to change sectors or kind of take on new skills, particularly if they're coming from communities where those resource tools or skilling opportunities are not as easily available in the first place, there aren't a lot of ways for them to connect to new things, whether that be through their employer in a new sector or a new area as well. And so wanting to understand, how do we connect all of these different pieces of information that are out there, but people either don't have the resources or the knowledge to kind of put the building blocks together. And I think the other thing that really struck us was that, yes, we have federal workforce systems, but those systems are really disjointed. And what ends up happening is that so much is left to individual states, where depending on if folks want to take federal funding or not, it's really left to municipalities, cities, and kind of localized regions to figure out how to create and enhance economic opportunity for a lot of their citizens. And so the quality of services end up differing so much based solely on where you live and where you kind of have the privilege to be able to move to as well.
Yeah, and I think another complementary piece that's coming out here is that people face both a financial and a time crunch. And this is in the really smart framing Abby's putting together that we're finalizing now. And that's a space where policymakers have a role, but so does civil society, so does the faith community, so do employers, right? Like, if you're spending a lot of time, as Anita just said, commuting to either work or your additional sort of training and skilling opportunity at the local community college, that's time when you're not with your kid, or that's time not doing engagement with your community that you might want to do. And so there's a real mismatch between people's lived experience and what they desire for their life to look like. And I think the pandemic kind of ripped that open, right, and allowed people maybe time and space to sort of think about that in new ways. But these are sort of long-standing crunches and challenges. We can do better on that front. I think Convergence can hold a space to sort out some of those solutions that are not just cross-partisan, which is a big part of it for sure, and what the public investment should be, but that are also cross-sectoral. And so both of these tables are going to have really rich participation from folks, not with a policy hat on, really thinking about what's it like to get up and face this stuff as a parent who's juggling so many things every day on the financial front, but also on the time front.
Before we move on to another question, do any of our Leadership Council members have a question?
I think Bill Bowling, who we know and love from Atlanta, has
Well,
got his hand up.
I'm wondering, Russell, and for all Abby and Anita, I work a lot with the hospitality community, and you know, their back has been against the wall as they during COVID, and then they're trying to hire people back. I think at least the folks I know who are restaurant owners, they have empathy. They understand it, but do we have data to show that if we treat people well, if we take in consideration, you know, the time it takes to travel, or how do you get home at night on your second shift, those kind of things. Do we have data to show that the value proposition, is this going to pay off for you?
Well, I'll take
I mean,
the
it
first.
makes all the sense in the world, but you know, you've got to get beyond just, well, that makes sense.
I'll take a first stab at that, Bill. And one of my former bosses was the Starbucks founder, Howard Schultz, which continues to be, but at the time was a particularly innovative company in offering healthcare to part-time employees and paid family leave and other benefits that, you know, typically people might not get in a part-time job or in a hospitality job or retail job. And people would even take jobs at Starbucks because of the healthcare, and they had a surprising retention relative to other types of firms. So that's one example. And in aggregate, I think, you know, there are plenty of other places where that data exists. I think the challenge that I've run into in this space is once you get to kind of smaller businesses, people who don't have the financial margin to take on those costs, it becomes a lot harder. And so that's where I really believe there's a role for the private sector to take care of its employees, invest in people as fully human and not just workers. And yet there's probably also a role for government and civil society as a safety net, so that even, you know, if you work at a place that has 4 employees and, you know, they can't accommodate you being gone 3 days a week, if you're a kid, that there's other places that can help you with that.
Okay.
Anita or Russell, any thoughts about that question?
I'll just add, I do think that we heard even in the original Working Up project and more recently from employers that, I mean, increasingly with the competition for workers, there's actually sort of like a requirement that some employers step up because they want to hold on, they want to retain people. But yeah, that some of the investments they've made in workers have a significant brand building and bottom line ROI benefit. And I think we've had some employers tell us that they made some investments in folks, you know, around tuition assistance or something like that, that they thought would sort of propel them all to essentially leave after they obtained that additional credential. And in some cases, maybe they did because that's what made sense for their route, but then a lot of them stayed because it was connected to sort of a pay bump or other opportunities. And they also felt loyalty and connection to that employer. So I do think there's a way. Look, we don't live in a utopia. There's hard trade-offs here, right, between bottom lines and investments. But I think there is a sweet spot there for employers to find, especially if they're bigger. I think the hard questions Abby just raised, if they're smaller and the margins are super tight, then is where do those public investments fill gaps? And that's exactly the kind of thing, you know, the dialogue will be wrestling with.
It's certainly paid off for Chick-fil-A. I mean, that's been their model to take young people and, you know, really teach them a culture of service.
And I'll just add, you know, I think similar models like going off of Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out is also a place that we see that kind of employer support really leading to retention, as well as other places in retail like Costco, where you have employer flexibility actually from the data perspective being reported as one of the biggest reasons that people end up staying at a job. So actually maybe the pay has not gone up significantly, but the way that an employer has responded to someone's mental health, their socio-emotional well-being, those things have been had, I would say, a value add. A lot of companies have started to do what they call a pulse check or a status check. Instead of like an exit interview, they'll talk about like, why are you staying, right? Why haven't you left this job for something else? And we see a lot of companies, particularly in retail and hospitality, workers responding and saying, my employer has really listened to what we needed, right? And so there are some kind of individual reports which you can see through employer resource networks or employer resource groups, but also Burning Glass is a great resource for those as well.
You know, Abby, you may know Roz Brewer, who was the COO at Starbucks. She's CEO of Walgreens now. She's a good friend. I'm on the board with her. I'd encourage you to reach out to her, Russell, because she would very much be in this conversation.
Absolutely. Throw us on an email thread, Bill. We'll
Okay.
absolutely do a call. That sounds great. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions from council members? All right, then how about moving from your assessment to your dialogue phase? What are some of the conversations that you're most excited about setting the table for? Some of the things that you're most excited to have dialogue participants discuss. And we know Abby is still setting her table, but knowing that that's coming once they're together, what are some of those conversations that you think have the most potential? Anita, do you want to start since your table has been meeting, and then Abby?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm really excited about some of the conversations that we're starting to have and are going to have more so, which are led by trailblazing employers and workers around shifting the idea of like what a supportive employer looks like in our society right now. I think in a lot of the assessment interviews that we had, we kind of came in with pretty low expectations about what type of support we kind of thought employers were having for their workers. And we're really impressed by some of the innovations that folks had. Some of those folks are now sitting around our dialogue table and so are really spearheading within their industries, looking at things like manufacturing, tech, IT, and as well as kind of retail and other product sectors where we see different types of skills coming in and really kind of want to capitalize on the momentum right now where the pandemic world has given us, that we see the kind of ask of employers to step up being responded to really well, and want to make sure that we're not losing that that really springboard to have employers respond. I actually asked this question also though to my team members, and one of them had a great thought. So there's an economist named Janelle Jones, and she often talks about how if we create an economy where Black women, who are the group that faces generally highest economic burdens, can be thriving, then all workers will be prospering. And so I think within that vein, one of the things we're also thinking about is what supports can we provide to workers and the most vulnerable workers that if implemented, they can have kind of trickle down or other benefits effects to other less vulnerable groups, right? And so how can we target immigrants, folks who don't have access to digital devices, digital literacy, and help folks with these biggest barriers overcome those, which will then certainly kind of boost foundations of a lot of the economy that we're seeing have the biggest impacts and kind of challenges within our own economy today.
And, I'll add a couple of things that we're looking at exploring.
Is Abby frozen for everybody?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Abby may have
Okay.
frozen.
See if she comes up. It might work if she's off video.
You want to try again, Abby?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you without
yeah.
the video. Go ahead.
Sorry about that, everyone. One, do we just give cash to people, to parents with young kids? If so, kind of to who, how much? How does that interact with existing programs? Something we've heard a lot of discussion about is states with kind of Washington's dysfunction are doing a lot of innovation on the childcare side, putting forward all sorts of things from new departments that are focused on early childhood education to helping braid together funding from employers and individuals and the state for childcare costs. There's a lot of innovation happening in that space. The childcare industry in general was pretty obliterated during the pandemic, got support funding that's expiring. How does an industry like that kind of stay on a solid footing going forward, considering it is, a significant work support, but also how can a bunch of different types of childcare providers flourish for people who are working non-traditional hours or who want certain types of care for their children. And then, I think one of the big things we will talk about, I just can't help myself coming from an economics background, is do we have the data? Are we asking even the questions on these national surveys that we would need to be asking to actually know if families are thriving? So we have data on child poverty and we have data on maternal labor force participation, but are there other ways to actually get under that next level of if families are kind of having the number of kids they want to have, the time with their kids they want to have, the types of jobs they want to have, kind of go down to that next level on thriving families. So I'm excited to chat about that.
I'll just add the great points from both of you. At a meta level, look, we're in a really hard moment. There's a ton of things going on that are incredibly difficult and complicated in the country and in the world. But I'm a little bit hopeful about these projects because of the opportunities the moment affords us. And so in both cases, I mean, some terrible things have happened. I mean, we've all lived through a pandemic. That also breaks the space open a little bit and shakes loose some conversation in some interesting ways, because folks have sort of been forced to try some new things and to have some new models. And the salience on these issues is very, very high, right? Maybe higher than it's ever been, even though, as Abby said, these are longstanding challenges. The broad public is now more aware than ever of the trade-offs that folks with kids, especially younger kids, have to make around working care. So that opens up the space. We've had workers facing rough antisocial behavior sometimes if they're in frontline customer service roles. You've seen lots of reports of that in the media, as folks have had difficult experiences. Do they vote with their feet and leave that job? That breaks the space open, and that maybe changes the dynamic around how employers decide to intervene and build the talent pipelines they need. So, no one's relishing the fact that we've had some rough sledding here, but I do think there's a moment in which the conversations are opened up and people are searching for some answers, or searching for new models. Should Congress change hands in the fall, there might be some interesting heterodox thinking happening on Capitol Hill. But as Abby said, there's lots of layers beneath the federal policy level to drive change here that we're also really, bullish about. So I think the moment does afford us a space to kind of frame these issues up in a really interesting and powerful way.
Thanks, Russell. We have a question in the chat, Anita and Abby, if you have any thoughts about how labor having a bit more leverage, at least in some spaces these days, whether that and how that might be affecting the areas that you're working on.
Oh, Bill, it's a Pandora's box. A tight labor market is typically really bad for childcare providers because they can get a higher paying job at Amazon. And so you have a shortage in the provider space. Inflation's kicking in. I mean, Secretary Powell just today is talking about potential recession. So all of a sudden the pressures that would have helped low-wage workers from the market and offering more benefits, companies are taking back job offers that they've put out there. So it's a really kind of topsy-turvy environment. I think the thing that I've come to realize about it, specific to like employer policies for new parents, is that at any given time, the share of a workforce with a really young kid is not huge and not the majority of people. And so it's a lot easier to compete on the basis of things that you can talk about, like wages, healthcare, retirement, things that go to all the employees. And when you start talking about supports for parents with young kids, that's a smaller segment of the workforce. And so you haven't seen the growth in those types of benefits like how you've seen in other ones, which is just kind of a persistent challenge.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly that I think, we're really intentional about having different worker voice and labor groups represented, particularly from those, for example, from hospitality, food service, from maybe caregivers as well, thinking about what types of leverage worker groups do have and how they're kind of responding to, for example, different employers, and different sectors have really different responses to this, right? And so I think this is where the size of the employer really, really comes into play. And so what types of resources are even available for somebody to offer to new folks coming in the door, right? And so it's changing hiring patterns. You really see small, medium businesses struggling in a lot of places. And the conversation about how they can change their hiring practices, be more kind of inclusive and supportive, is really different from big players. And so you have a lot of these titans, I would say, expanding some of their policies and putting a lot of resources towards supporting employers, but you see other types of businesses just not being able to do this. And so how can we kind of balance and work between the two is something we're talking a lot about.
Great. Thank you, Anita and Abby and Russell. We have one more question in the chat, but we are at time. And so I'm hoping the two of you, when we get back together after our break, could throw any thoughts about Mark's question in the chat. But one quick rapid fire for our three panelists before we wrap up, and that is, we've seen some of these issues and potential solutions be included in the Build Back Better bill. So I'm wondering if the three of you would be so bold as to venture any guesses. Is there anything that was in Build Back Better that you think might be moving forward anytime soon? And just a quick little snippet before we go to our break.
Well, there's certainly a couple things that now have, politics has its way of destroying certain things, but there are pieces of it that now Republicans and Democrats have put together. One is a CCDBG, which is a child care, to Mark's question, a child care block grant that goes to states and states can parse out. There's a bipartisan interest on that. Second is, do we give cash to families monthly? Since a lot of these programs aren't delivering support to who they need to. So I think those two things, and last, I'd be remiss to say maybe something on paid parental leave, because that's just where we're such a huge global outlier. And I think both political parties are kind of coming around to wanting to fix that. So I would say those three pieces of Build Back Better.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, none of us has, I don't have a bug in Senator Manchin's office. Maybe someone else on the call does. So, we'll see what emerges in the coming months. But, it's not on a sweet spot for these projects, but something that's still alive, I think, from the larger Build Back Better bill that might, in a more narrow effort that might still move forward, is the more generous healthcare subsidies, especially around the Affordable Care Act policies, which that has huge impacts for families and what disposable income they have left, or the money they have available for other things like childcare, if their sort of out-of-pocket healthcare costs are capped. So not where these projects are focusing, but there's a domino effect, right? If those benefits, which were passed earlier, those expanded subsidies, if they're extended, that'll have a domino effect on other costs for families.
Yeah, and also I'll just add from the Pathways perspective, I'm really hopeful that there will be more funding released to community college and industry partnership possibilities, also that go towards adult education and literacy, looking at digital literacy, career and technical education. I feel like those are some areas where if we are able to get kind of funding released and have it flow into workforce dollars, that would be amazing, as well as just some more increased flexibility for funds. We don't see a lot of kind of stipends where individuals who participate in federally funded workforce programs have the flexibility to use that however they might want to, right? Whether it go to mitigating childcare or transportation costs. And so having the flexibility of some of those funds really expand is something that I'm hoping will come out of additional layers of and kind of new iterations of Build Back Better.
Thank you, Anita, Abby, and Russell, for your thoughtful answers and reflections today, and for all of your work on your dialogues in this impact area.